The prairie wind carried the smell of dust and smoke that morning, the kind of smell that told of something more than a simple fire. It rolled in across the dry grasslands like an omen, filling the lungs with a bitter taste of warning. The sky above stretched wide, endless, painted in hues of pale gold and gray, as if heaven itself knew what was about to unfold. The land was quiet, but it was not a gentle silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, before violence breaks loose and changes everything. And at the center of it stood a woman, heavy with child, but carrying herself with a strength that no one expected. She had lived in this land long enough to understand its cruel ways. Out here on the frontier, life was not written in comfort or ease. It was carved with blood, grit, and the relentless will to survive. Settlers who came chasing dreams of land and freedom often found only hardship and graves. The winds could strip a man of hope, and the soil demanded sacrifice before giving back a harvest. Yet she endured, carrying her unborn child and believing that somehow she could carve a place in this vast wilderness where her family would be safe. But the prairie had a way of testing even the strongest souls. The people of the territory spoke in hushed tones about raids and broken treaties. Whispers traveled faster than riders, telling of burned cabins, vanished travelers, and the kind of justice that was never written in courts but in the spilling of blood. There were always two sides to those stories, each one shadowed by grief and vengeance. Between the settlers and the Apache people, the ground had grown stained with anger that would not wash away. It was in the heart of that fire that she found herself, alone carrying life within her, and standing at a moment where fate would demand more of her than she thought she could ever give. She was no stranger to hardship. She had buried children before, felt the cold bite of hunger, and learned the weight of a rifle as surely as she had learned the weight of bread in her hands. But nothing had prepared her for the choice she was about to make. The Apache warriors had been captured days earlier, bound in ropes and thrown against the cruelty of men who saw only enemies in their eyes. The air in the settlement was thick with hatred, and the talk was of punishment, of making examples that would send fear riding across the desert. There was no talk of mercy. Mercy had long since been lost in the echoes of screams and the smoke of burning homes. Yet as she walked past them, the sight of those bound men stirred something inside her that she could not quiet. Their faces were marked with exhaustion, sunburned skin stretched over sharp bones. They were warriors, yes, but in that moment they were also sons, brothers, and perhaps fathers. Their eyes carried the weight of old battles, but also the flicker of something human that could not be hidden beneath paint or scars. She should have looked away, should have listened to the voices around her that said they were dangerous, that to show them compassion was to invite ruin. But something stronger than reason spoke within her, and it would not be silenced. She carried the weight of her child and the weight of her past. She remembered the nights when she herself had felt helpless, when cruelty had cut through her life without mercy. She remembered the fear of being powerless, the ache of wishing for someone to see her suffering and do something, anything. Now, as she looked at those 5 men bound in ropes, she felt that same ache rise again, but this time it burned with a fierce determination. The night was black and still when she made her choice. The campfires had burned low, and most of the settlement lay in uneasy sleep. She moved like a shadow, her breath shallow, her heart pounding with each step. The blade in her hand was small, worn from use in the kitchen, not forged for battle, but it gleamed in the dim light with the promise of freedom. Her belly was heavy, every movement a reminder that she was not alone in her risk. Yet she pressed on, the weight of both life and death pushing her forward. When the first rope fell beneath her blade, the sound was barely more than a whisper. But in that whisper came the shift of destiny. One by one, she cut the ropes, her hands trembling but steady enough to finish what her heart had commanded her to do. The warriors did not speak, only met her eyes with a silent intensity that said more than words ever could. There was no promise that they would spare her, no assurance that she would live to see the morning. But in that moment, trust was forged in silence, born from desperation and fire. The last rope slipped away, and the men rose slowly, like shadows given breath. For a heartbeat, time stood still. She could hear only the pounding of her heart, the rustle of wind across the dry grass, and the soft crunch of footsteps as the warriors stepped free. She had unleashed something far larger than herself, something that would not be contained again. She knew it in her bones. What she had done was not simply an act of mercy. It was an invitation of vengeance, a spark that would call down a storm from the north, a storm that men whispered of like a curse. They called him the devil from the north, a name spoken in fear and anger, a name that rode with stories of fire and retribution. Some said he was a warrior born of endless winters, hardened by loss until no pity remained in his soul. Others claimed he was not a man at all, but a spirit of vengeance that the land itself had birthed to answer blood with blood. She did not know which was true, but as she watched those freed warriors vanish into the darkness, she felt the weight of that name settle over her like a shadow that would never lift. The dawn would bring consequences. There would be no hiding what she had done, no way to shield herself or her unborn child from the storm that was coming. The settlement would demand answers, and the warriors would return with fury that none could stop. She had chosen compassion, but compassion here was sharper than a knife, more dangerous than any weapon. Still, she did not regret it. Somewhere deep inside, beyond fear and doubt, she believed that what she had done was right. Perhaps it would destroy her, perhaps it would bring ruin upon everything she had hoped to build. But in that single act of cutting ropes, she had chosen humanity over hatred, life over death. And sometimes the right choice was the one that cost the most. The night closed around her, heavy with silence, heavy with secrets. She pressed her hand to her swollen belly, feeling the faint stir of life within, and whispered a promise that she would not falter, no matter what storm came. But even as the words left her lips, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves in the distance, the echo of vengeance already stirring. And in that sound lay the truth she could not escape. By setting them free, she had not only changed her fate, she had awakened the devil from the north, and his shadow was already riding closer. The first light of dawn spilled across the plains like a pale curtain, chasing away the night but not the unease that clung to her heart. She stood by the cabin window, staring out at the horizon, waiting for the world to show its hand. The prairie had a way of hiding secrets until the very last moment, and she knew well enough that danger could come from anywhere. Her hand rested on her belly, a habit she had grown into as if steadying herself through the child within. She could not tell if the small stirrings she felt were kicks or just her own nerves, but she drew strength from them all the same. She thought back to the night before. The memory of her knife cutting through coarse rope would not leave her. She could still feel the fibers pulling against the blade, the tension snapping loose in her grip. Every cut had been a decision, every release a choice she could never take back. She had freed 5 Apache warriors, and in doing so she had set loose a storm that would change the land forever. She did not know where they had gone, but she knew enough of the world to understand they would not vanish quietly. The settlement around her was waking now. Smoke rose from chimneys, roosters called out against the morning air, and the tired voices of men drifted from the stables. They had no idea yet what had happened. They still believed the 5 prisoners were bound and broken, waiting for judgment. When the truth came to light, there would be fury, there would be accusations, suspicion, and blood in the dirt. She would be at the center of it, though no one yet knew. Her husband had been gone for months, driving cattle farther north. Letters came rarely, carried by riders who braved the dangerous trails, and even when they did arrive, they brought little comfort. Words written in haste could not soothe the nights of fear, the long days of loneliness, or the burdens she carried alone. She had grown used to standing on her own, but now she wished with all her heart that he was there. For no one else could understand the weight of what she had done. Her eyes shifted to the edge of the plains where the land met the sky. There, beyond sight, but not beyond reach, was where stories of the devil from the north had taken root. She had heard the tales whispered by traders and soldiers, each one darker than the last. Some spoke of a warrior whose cruelty matched the winter storms, a man who had seen his people slaughtered and vowed never to rest until the land itself wept red. Others claimed he was not a man at all, but something born from old curses, a shadow that followed the Apache like a guardian of vengeance. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: where he rode, death followed. The thought of him sent a shiver through her, though she had never laid eyes on him. She wondered what kind of man could carry such a name, such a burden of fear. And more than that, she wondered if he knew yet that the 5 warriors had been set free. If he did, then the land would not stay quiet for long. Behind her, the sound of boots crunching across the dirt yard broke her thoughts. She turned from the window and watched as the sheriff and two of his men crossed toward the holding shed. Her chest tightened. She wanted to cry out, to run, to hide, but none of those were options anymore. The truth would come, and it would come fast. The sheriff was a man of narrow patience and narrower mercy. I had been a soldier before wearing the badge, and he carried the war in his eyes. He had seen too much to believe in second chances. To him, the world was divided into enemies and allies, and enemies were dealt with quickly. When the ropes were found cut, when the shed stood empty, there would be no reasoning with him. Someone would pay, and the settlement would prepare for war. She stepped outside, the morning light striking her face, and she tried to steady her breathing. Women were already gathering at the well, children chasing one another through the dust, and the blacksmith hammering metal with steady rhythm. It looked like any other morning, but beneath the surface, a storm was waiting. She felt as though she carried the secret in her very skin, and surely someone would see it if they looked too closely. Her thoughts drifted back to the warriors. She had not known their names. She had not asked. But their eyes had burned with something that haunted her now. They had not pleaded for freedom. They had not begged. They had simply watched her with a stillness that seemed older than the land itself. In their silence, she had felt judgment, gratitude, and promise all woven together. She wondered where they had gone. To their people? To their leader? To the devil himself? The sound of shouting broke through the morning calm. It came from the shed. Her heart leaped into her throat as she watched men rush to the sheriff's side. Dust rose from their boots, and the hammering of the blacksmith stopped. The town turned its eyes toward the commotion. And then the words rang out clear enough for all to hear. The prisoners were gone. The ripple of fear moved through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Men cursed, women clutched their children closer, and the sheriff's face hardened like stone. He barked orders, sending riders to track, to search, to prepare. He swore that the settlement would not be taken by surprise, not again. The people nodded, some with anger, some with terror, but all with the same heavy dread. She stood among them, her hands clasped together, her face a mask of worry like the rest. Inside, her heart pounded so loud she thought it might give her away. She wanted to scream that it was her, that she had done it, that they should not waste their fury on each other, but she stayed silent. Her voice would not change their anger. It would only turn it upon her and her unborn child. The sheriff spoke of vengeance, of protecting what was theirs. He promised they would hunt down the escapees, and when they found them, none would be spared. The people cheered at his words, but the cheer was hollow, born of fear more than courage. As the riders saddled their horses, she turned her gaze once more to the horizon. The wind carried with it a strange stillness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Somewhere out there, the 5 warriors were riding hard, carrying with them the knowledge of her choice. And somewhere beyond them, if the stories were true, the devil from the north would be waiting. That night, the fires of the settlement burned brighter than usual, their glow pushing back the dark. Men patrolled with rifles, women whispered prayers, and children were hushed to sleep with trembling voices. She sat alone by her cabin door, listening to the crackle of flames and the restless stir of the prairie. Her hand rested once more on her belly, and she whispered promises of safety to the life within. But her promises felt thin against the weight of what she had set in motion. She could not shake the image of those freed warriors, their silent eyes, their steady steps into the night. She could not shake the stories of the devil who rode with vengeance in his heart, and she could not escape the feeling that her choice had bound her to their fate in ways she could not yet see. The night grew colder, the stars sharper against the dark sky. Far off, beyond sight, the faint sound of drums echoed against the wind. She did not know if they were real or only in her mind, but they carried with them a promise. Something was coming, something vast and unstoppable. And she knew then that her life, her child's life, and the fate of the settlement were no longer her own to command. They belonged to the storm she had unleashed when she cut those ropes. That storm was already gathering strength. The prairie stretched wide and restless under the burning sun, its silence broken only by the buzz of insects and the distant cry of hawks circling above. It was the kind of silence that gnawed at men, made them look over their shoulders, and sharpened the edge of fear. The riders sent out by the sheriff had not returned. No dust trails marked their paths. No word had come back. The longer the settlement waited, the heavier the air grew with dread. People whispered in corners, their voices low, as if the very wind might carry their words to enemies unseen. She felt it in her bones, too, that heaviness. Every face she saw seemed carved with suspicion. The townsfolk were restless, their trust thinning like old rope. They looked for someone to blame, someone to carry the weight of their unease. And though no finger had yet pointed at her, she felt as though their eyes lingered too long, as though they saw more than she wished to show. She kept her head down, tending to chores with slow, steady hands, but her thoughts were not her own. They were out there, running across the wild lands, those 5 men she had freed. And somewhere beyond them was the devil from the north. It was not just the fear of attack that gripped the people. It was the uncertainty. The settlement had built itself on hard work and harder promises. Families had buried loved ones in the soil, planted crops beside their graves, and told themselves that all of it meant something, that this land could be theirs if they just held on long enough. But the land had never promised them peace. It belonged to no one, and it gave its loyalty to none. In the blacksmith's shop, the hammering grew louder as men gathered to speak of defense. Rifles were checked, powder weighed, and arguments flared about whether to stay and fight or pack up and flee before the storm broke. Some wanted to hold their ground, proud and stubborn, unwilling to leave behind the sweat and blood they had poured into the place. Others spoke with trembling voices, saying no piece of land was worth their children's lives. And through it all, the sheriff stood like a wall, declaring there would be no retreat. To leave was to show weakness, and weakness only brought death faster. She listened when she could, though she said nothing. She knew the sheriff was wrong, and one-way strength alone could not stop what was coming. But she also knew the ones who spoke of fleeing would find no safety elsewhere. The land had turned to war, and there was no road that led clear of it. That night, when the fires burned low, she heard another sound beneath the restless stir of the wind. Hooves. Slow, steady, like a heartbeat pressing into the earth. She froze by her window, peering into the dark, and saw the faint shape of a rider at the edge of the plains. He did not move closer, did not call out, only sat upon his horse, as though carved from shadow itself. The firelight flickered across his figure, but his face was lost to the night. She thought of the stories of the devil who came from the north, and her breath caught in her throat. Before she could decide whether it was real or a trick of her weary mind, the rider turned and vanished into the dark. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they kept silent. But she knew what she had seen. The storm was not far now. In the days that followed, the settlement hardened itself. Men dug trenches, sharpened stakes, and posted guards at every corner. Women prepared what food they could, hiding stores of grain and water. Children were kept inside, their laughter replaced by uneasy silence. Life had narrowed to waiting, and waiting bred fear. Yet beneath all of it, another kind of conflict simmered, mistrust among their own. Who had freed the warriors? Who had cut the ropes? The question passed from mouth to mouth, each voice lower than the last, but sharper with suspicion. The sheriff swore it was done by someone from outside, a sympathizer, a traitor working with the Apache. But even he could not hide the way his eyes searched the faces of his own people. And she felt those eyes on her, heavy as the weight she carried within. Meanwhile, far from the settlement, the 5 warriors rode hard. Their journey took them through canyons and over rivers, their silence broken only by the rhythm of hooves and the calls of night creatures. They did not speak of the woman who had freed them, but her face lingered in their thoughts. She had given them back their lives, and in doing so, had set them on a path that would not turn aside. They knew where they were headed, knew who they must find. The one they called the devil was not a name to them, but a man of blood and memory, a leader forged from fire and loss. They would seek him, and when they found him, vengeance would rise like a storm that no settlement could withstand. Back in town, the preacher tried to steady hearts with words of faith. His voice carried through the chapel, promising that no evil could stand against those who stood in righteousness. But even as he spoke, his hands trembled on the pulpit. Faith alone could not drive away the fear that pressed on them from every side. Some clung to his words like a lifeline, while others muttered that faith would not stop bullets or arrows. She found herself caught between those worlds. Her heart believed in mercy, believed that there was something greater than vengeance. Yet her mind could not deny what she had seen in the eyes of the warriors she had freed. They carried wounds too deep to heal with words. And behind them loomed the shadow of the devil who would bring those wounds to the settlement's doorstep. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Each dawn riders were sent out, and each dusk they returned with nothing but silence. The land seemed to swallow their search hole, hiding its secrets well. In one morning, just as the sun split the horizon, smoke was seen rising in the distance. A small homestead to the south had been burned. No survivors were found. The settlement tightened its grip on fear, and the sheriff swore vengeance. The devil had sent his message. She could not sleep that night. The cries of the bereaved carried through the dark, and the sound of hammers building barricades echoed like a dirge. She sat by her cabin door, the weight of her child heavy within her, and wondered if mercy had been a mistake. Had she doomed them all by letting compassion guide her hand, or had she been right, and this storm would have come regardless of what she had done? The rider returned that night. She saw him again, standing at the edge of the plains, a shadow that would not move closer. She felt his eyes upon her, though the distance stretched wide. This time she knew he was no phantom of her mind. He was watching, waiting, measuring. The devil from the north had come. She did not tell the others. What good would it do? They would call her mad. Or worse, they would turn their suspicion into rage. Instead, she kept the sight to herself, though the knowledge burned in her chest. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw him again, silent and still. His presence pressing against her like a weight she could not shake. The conflict was no longer just between the settlement and the Apache. It was within her too. She carried two truths, one that said she had done right, and one that whispered she had destroyed them all. The land itself seemed caught in that same tension, holding its breath, waiting to see which truth would rise. And as the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of drums once more, she understood that the waiting was nearly over. The storm was gathering not only outside their walls but within every heart. And when it broke, nothing would remain untouched. The days bled into nights, and the nights stretched into something colder, heavier. Every sound in the dark seemed sharper now, every creak of wood, every howl of a coyote on the hills. The settlement lived on edge, its people carrying rifles even to the well, children hushed into silence, doors bolted tight. The riders who returned brought only grim tidings. More smoke seen on the horizon, another ranch burned to ash, another family vanished without a trace. Each loss tightened the grip of fear, and each whisper of the devil from the north spread like fire through dry grass. She moved through it all like a shadow herself, carrying her secret and the weight of the life within her. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling beams, her hand pressed against her belly, listening to the faint heartbeat of the town around her. The patrols never ceased now. Men circled the cabins with rifles slung across their shoulders, their faces drawn and restless. Yet no one could stop the dread that seeped into their bones. She wondered if they were already surrounded, if unseen eyes were watching them from the tall grass, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sheriff had grown harsher with each passing day. His orders snapped like whips, and his patience thinned to nothing. He demanded answers, demanded loyalty, demanded the kind of obedience that fear breeds. Yet even he could not mask the worry etched into his face. He knew as well as the rest that they were not dealing with an ordinary enemy. This was no quick raid, no reckless attack. This was something calculated, something that moved like a storm building its strength until the sky itself split. Rumors swirled among the people. Some said the Apache had gathered allies from other bands, swelling their numbers until no wall could keep them out. Others swore the devil from the north had been seen riding at dusk, his horse black as night, his figure cloaked in smoke. Each tale grew darker with each telling, and no one dared challenge them, for fear that to deny the stories would invite them to come true. The preacher tried to rally hope, speaking of faith and courage, but his voice shook, and his words seemed hollow against the restless silence. The blacksmith worked longer hours, shaping bullets and blades with arms that trembled, though he never admitted it. Mothers held their children tighter, whispering prayers that felt more like pleas. For her, every step carried the weight of the secret she bore. She had cut the ropes. She had set this into motion. No one knew it, yet she felt as though every eye could see it written on her face. She carried the guilt like another life inside her, one that grew heavier with every dawn. And still, despite the fear, she could not say she regretted it. Something in her heart told her it had been right, though the cost was more than she had ever imagined. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, the sound of drums echoed faintly through the wind. They were distant, almost swallowed by the plains, but real enough to still every hand, to freeze the very air. The people stopped where they stood, listening, their faces pale in the fading light. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The drums spoke for themselves. That night, guards doubled on the walls. Fires burned high, casting long shadows that flickered like restless spirits. She stood at her cabin door, staring into the dark, her breath shallow. The drums had stopped, but their echo lingered in her chest. Somewhere out there, men were gathering. Somewhere out there, vengeance was waiting. She saw him again. At the far edge of the plains, where the land met the sky, a rider stood motionless. This time, closer than before, the firelight brushing the faint outline of his shoulders, the shape of the horse beneath him. He made no move to approach, no gesture of peace or war. He only watched. She could not see his face, but she felt the weight of his gaze pressing against her, colder than the night air. The devil from the north was not just a story anymore. He was here. The next morning, the sheriff called every man into the square. His voice was raw with urgency as he laid out his plan. Patrols would sweep farther, defenses tightened, no one allowed beyond the barricades. What he swore the settlement would hold, that they would not bow to fear. Yet even as he spoke, she could see it in the eyes of the men doubt, unspoken, but heavy. They knew the sheriff was speaking against the tide, and tides had no mercy. It was then that suspicion sharpened like a blade. The sheriff demanded to know how the warriors had escaped. He accused traitors, said someone among them had betrayed their people, had cut the ropes and set the fire to their future. His eyes swept the crowd, hard and searching. Her heart hammered so loud she thought it might give her away. She kept her head low, her hands folded, her face calm. But inside, she burned with terror. No one spoke. No one confessed. The silence was enough to breed more distrust. Neighbors eyed each other with narrowed glances. Friends questioned friends. The unity that once bound them began to crack, and into those cracks fear seeped like water, spreading wider with every word left unsaid. As the sun set again, riders returned with grim faces. Tracks had been found, signs of movement. The truth was clear. They were being surrounded. The Apache were drawing the circle tighter, waiting for the right moment to strike. The devil from the north had not come to scare them. He had come to break them. She felt her child stir inside her as she sat by the fire that night, her mind racing. She wondered if her child would ever see peace, or if its first cry would rise in the midst of smoke and blood. She whispered to it, promises she was no longer sure she could keep. She prayed silently, not for her own life, but for the strength to do what must be done when the storm finally broke. The night grew restless. Horses shifted uneasily in the stables. Dogs barked at shadows, and the guards along the walls swore they saw figures moving in the dark. The tension pulled tight, a bowstring ready to snap. And then deep into the night, the drums returned. Louder this time, steady and unrelenting, carrying across the plains like thunder. With them came the sound of chanting, faint but rising, a rhythm that matched the pounding of her own heart. The people gathered in silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide. The sheriff barked orders, rifles were loaded, and the fires on the barricades burned higher. Every man stood at his post, every woman held her children close. The sound grew louder, closer, pressing against the walls like a tide about to surge. And then came the cry of a horn, long and low, carried on the wind. It was not the sound of warning, not the call of settlers, but something older, something that belonged to the land long before they had come. The sound rolled across the plains, echoing against the hills, and with it the people knew this was no bluff. The storm had arrived. She stood at her door, her heart pounding, her breath caught between fear and defiance. She knew that the moment she had feared since the night she cut those ropes was upon her. The devil from the north was here, and he had brought the weight of vengeance with him. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the sound of hooves that followed the drums. Closer and closer, until the night was alive with the promise of violence. The settlement waited, rifles ready, eyes wide, hearts breaking beneath the weight of the silence between the drums. She clutched her belly, whispering to her unborn child, and prayed for strength. Because she knew that before the dawn came, the land would be soaked in blood. And the choice she had made in mercy would either save them all or destroy everything they had ever known. The drums rolled like thunder through the night, steady and unrelenting, and then the silence shattered as the first strike came. Arrows cut the air, flames leapt from the barricades, and the ground shook beneath the charge of horses. The settlement answered with rifles, the sharp cracks of gunfire tearing into the night, each flash of powder a desperate plea for survival. Smoke thickened, screams rose, and the air filled with the chaos of men and women fighting for the fragile piece of land they had carved out of the wilderness. She clutched her belly, the unborn child within her, reminding her with every stir that she carried more than her own life. She wanted to run, to hide, but her heart anchored her to the door, unable to turn away from the storm she had unleashed. Through the smoke and fire, she saw shadows moving with purpose, warriors striking fast, disappearing and striking again. They were not reckless. They fought like the land itself had trained them, with patience and precision. And above them all, riding at the heart of the storm, was the figure she had feared for so long. The devil from the north came into the firelight at last. His face was carved with scars of old battles, his eyes cold but burning with a fury older than memory. He rode with a command that bent the night to his will, every movement of his hand directing the tide of vengeance. He was no phantom, no spirit. He was flesh and blood, a man forged by pain and sharpened by loss. The settlers had named him the devil, but as she watched him ride through the fire, she understood he was a man who carried the weight of the dead and answered it with war. The sheriff stood against him with a rifle in his hands and defiance in his voice. He called the people to hold the line, to stand their ground no matter the cost. He fought with all the fury of a man who had nothing left but pride, but even his iron will could not bend the storm. One by one, the barricades gave way, flames tore through homes, and the screams of the wounded filled the night. Yet the people did not collapse. They fought back, not because they believed they could win, but because they refused to give up what little they had left. She saw neighbors she had known for years fight shoulder to shoulder, their fear swallowed by the fire of survival. She saw women dragging water to put out flames, children carrying powder to men on the walls, every soul bound together by the moment. And she felt the truth sink into her chest. This was no simple battle. It was the land itself deciding who belonged, who had the will to endure, who could carry both mercy and vengeance without breaking. The fight stretched through the night, neither side yielding, both burning themselves down to embers. The sheriff fell before dawn, struck not by an arrow but by the exhaustion of a man who had given everything. Last cry was not of anger but of warning, urging his people to live, to stand even without him. His fall shook the settlement, but it did not break them. They fought on, desperate and raw, every shot and strike driven by the will to see the morning. And then, as the first pale light of dawn cut across the horizon, the drums slowed, the chanting faded. The storm that had raged all night began to pull back. The Apache warriors, their vengeance answered in blood and fire, withdrew as suddenly as they had come. The devil from the north lingered at the edge of the smoke, his figure tall and unbroken, his gaze sweeping across what remained of the settlement. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than any cry. He had made his mark, left his warning, and shown that no chain, no rope, no betrayal of his people would go unanswered. Then, with a single motion, he turned his horse and rode back into the wide land, his warriors following like shadows pulled into the rising sun. The settlement lay broken in the aftermath. Homes smoldered, fields were blackened, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Yet amidst the ruins, life still clung stubbornly. The people gathered, tending to one another, burying their dead with hands that trembled but did not stop. They spoke little, for words could not mend what the night had taken, when their silence was a promise that they would not vanish. She walked among them, her belly heavy, her heart torn between guilt and relief. She knew what she had done. She had freed the 5 warriors, and in doing so, had brought the storm upon them. Yet she also knew that storm would have come regardless. The land had been carrying its anger long before her knife touched rope. She had simply lit the fire already waiting to burn. And in that knowledge, she found a strange kind of peace. When her child stirred within her, she whispered promises of strength and survival. She swore the child would know both the cost of mercy and the burden of vengeance. She swore the child would understand that choices were never simple, that sometimes the line between right and wrong blurred until only the heart could guide the way. The people rebuilt in the weeks that followed. Slowly, cabins rose again. Fences were mended, fields tilled. Life returned, scarred but enduring. They spoke often of the sheriff, of his defiance and his fall, holding him as a symbol of their will. They spoke too of the devil from the north, his shadow lingering across every horizon. His name was a warning, a reminder that the land could not be taken without consequence, but they did not speak of her role. Her secret remained her own, buried deep in her chest like a stone she would carry forever. Seasons turned, and in time, the prairie softened once more. Grass grew over the blackened earth, flowers pushed through the ash, and the sound of children's laughter returned to the wind. But the memory of that night never left. It lived in the people's eyes, in the silence that followed their stories, in the way they looked to the horizon whenever the drums of thunder rolled. She gave birth to her child beneath that endless sky, her cries mingling with the whispers of the prairie. When she held the newborn in her arms, she felt the weight of all that had passed settle into her heart. The child was both a beginning and a reminder, proof that life endured even when fire swept through the land. She named the child quietly, choosing a name that carried both strength and hope, a name that would root them to the land while also reminding them of the storm that had given them life. As the years went on, stories of the devil from the north continued to drift through the territory. Some said he had vanished into the mountains, carrying his vengeance like a ghost. Others swore he still rode at night, watching, waiting for the next betrayal. His legend grew larger than the man himself, but she never forgot the truth. He was no devil. He was a man bound by grief and fire, a man who carried his people's pain as fiercely as she carried her child. Her child grew among the survivors, hearing the whispers of that night, but never the full truth. She kept her secret close, not out of fear, but because she wanted her child to learn the lesson in time that mercy is not weakness, that vengeance is not strength, and that both can burn through the world if not held with care. The prairie remained as it always had, wild, endless, and unforgiving. It tested every soul who dared to live upon it, stripping away illusions and leaving only truth. The truth was this: life on the frontier was not built on easy choices. It was carved from sacrifice, from pain, from hope that refused to die even in the darkest night. She often stood at her door as the sun set, watching the horizon where she had once seen the devil from the north. She no longer feared his shadow. Instead, she respected it, knowing that the land remembered him as it remembered all who had spilled their blood upon it. And in that respect, she found her own kind of strength. The story of the night the drums came to the settlement lived on, was told around fires, passed from one generation to the next, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in songs. Each telling changed, but at its heart remained the same, the tale of how vengeance rode from the north, how fire swept the land, and how life, fragile yet unyielding, endured. And so, as the years faded into memory, she carried her secret not as a burden, but as a part of the story itself. She had cut the ropes of 5 Apache warriors. She had unleashed a storm that nearly broke them. But she had also chosen mercy, and in that choice lay the seed of survival. For even in a land ruled by fire and vengeance, it was mercy that gave birth to life.